Chapter 12. Uncertainty and Change. 1975-1989. In the middle of the 70s, the recession, inflation, and unemployment cast a long shadow over the international climate. In an effort to prevent the slide towards instability and to harmonize the diverse world of politics, the Helsinki Act was signed in August 1975. The Act dealt with rights and freedoms, the sovereignty of nations, and the acceptance of prevailing governments. The doctrine was ratified 2 years after the Belgrade summit. It was necessary to tackle the problems. The balance of power between the superpowers favored peace. Brezhnev and Ford agreed to limit nuclear testing. The USSR approached the West to help calm the tension. Although the invasion of Afghanistan aggravated the situation, it did not prevent the USSR from signing treaties with Jimmy Carter and limiting the construction of strategic weapons. Brezhnev, a pragmatic man, gave greater importance to geopolitics than ideology. After his death at the end of 1982, Yuri Andropov assumed power. Andropov was succeeded by another old leader, Konstantin Chernenko. His death in 1985 elevated Mikhail Gorbachev to head of state. One of his first actions was to meet with Reagan in Geneva and break the ice. Nobody knew that he was to end the USSR's era of greatness and the USSR itself. In February 1986, at the Congress of the CPC, Gorbachev criticized the Brezhnev era, and although nobody dared to talk of the free market economy, legalized private work and began to release political prisoners. The dissident Sakharov returned to Moscow from his exile in Gorky. Gorbachev withdrew the troops posted to Mongolia and the Chinese border. The task that faced him was huge. Democratizing the country was not easy. The general dissatisfaction towards the new measures increased for most of 1987. In this year, problems within the system were exposed. The terms perestroika and reconstruction started to become fashionable. If the USSR, the world's principal producer of steel and oil, lacked these same products, and if they, as the greatest producer of cereals in the world, also imported millions of tons of it, something was surely not going well. The trauma of the reforms coincided with a nuclear accident at Chernobyl, not far from Kiev. Gorbachev needed help and American support to face the avalanche of problems that were piling up. He agreed with Reagan to dismantle the medium-distance weapons. The West called Gobi mania. Gorby was a good guy. However, the USSR was losing prestige. A young German landed his plane next to the Kremlin, making fun of the radar systems, and in the Norwegian Sea, a Soviet nuclear submarine sunk. These humiliations were not isolated incidents. The Union of the Republics began to split. Armenia and Azerbaijan saw the possibility of abandoning the Soviet boat, and they confronted the USSR. The cancer of nationalism was intensified by the religious and ethnic diversity of the region. The Baltic republics showed an impatience to recover the independence they had once enjoyed. The manifestations in Georgia were violently repressed, while the withdrawal of troops was initiated in Afghanistan. Everything happened very fast, even the reform of the Communist Party and political system. Bush and Gorbachev brought an end to the Cold War and announced disarmament in Malta. In the same year, the climate of optimism aided the visit to Peking by the recently elected President Bush in February 1989. World hopes grew for the re-establishment of Soviet-Chinese relations and the opening of a path to cooperation between the USSR and the European community. A new era was dawning, and it was the beginning of the end of the USSR's superpower status. So many changes were splitting the socialist bloc. The collapse had started in Poland with the creation of Solidarity by Lech Walesa in 1980. Tadeusz Maciejewski formed a government in 1989. Amid criticism of Moscow, Czechoslovakia's Politburo fell after Husak's reforms were announced and Gorbachev visited Prague. In the United States, Jimmy Carter's election to power in November 1976 coincided with the bicentenary of American independence. He spoke of a return to spiritual values despite the explosion of the Lockheed scandal, the network of bribes in the aeronautic industry. In his first presidential speech, Ronald Reagan made his intentions clear: increase the defense budget and withdraw funds from social programs. He stated that if the human rights issue was in order, a matter with which Carter had been obsessed, then their priority was security. In March 1983, the Strategic Plan of Defense, or Star Wars, designed to neutralize missiles in flight, demoralized the USSR, who were incapable of facing the challenge. After re-election, Reagan sought nuclear disarmament, and it became of key importance. In the United States and Europe, there was a new social awareness of the retired, poor, and marginalized. The economic recession that cut benefit programs had increased the quantity of unprotected citizens. Prices and inflation rose. In 1976, in the United Kingdom, James Callaghan replaced his party colleague Harold Wilson. Callaghan, a pragmatic man, resolved the economic crisis thanks to the oil in the North Sea and a social pact to moderate salaries. However, he could not keep power, and he lost the elections in 1979, the year in which Margaret Thatcher became the Conservative Prime Minister. Thatcher reduced public spending and restricted the circulation of money through monetarist policies. This policy provoked syndicalists to claim their rights and caused unrest, although the end result was a boost in the industry. In 1982, during the invasion of the Falklands, she sent nuclear warships and submarines. A year later, this action made her invincible during the elections. The electoral support gave her strength to confront the miners' strike that nearly brought the country to the edge of collapse. In view of the political resistance, there was one factor that was responsible for the third re-election of Thatcher in 1987. She personified the willpower of never letting yourself be beaten by events. In Italy, the economic crisis translated into political problems. The communists of Enrico Berlinguer obtained an incredible result, 35%, and the mayorship of Rome. This gave way to the historic compromise and his entry into government. Alessandro Pertini succeeded him. However, the problems in Italy were not only those of corruption. The Red Brigades assassinated the Prime Minister Aldo Moro, and 2 years later, terrorism reappeared in Bologna. Due to the failure of different cabinets, the socialist Bettino Craxi formed a coalition government in 1983. 1 year later, a report about the Masonic Lodge, Propaganda 2, was presented, in which personalities from Italy's political and social life were implicated. Following the resignation of Craxi in 1987, Cossiga took control and formed a government. However, he suffered 3 attempts to remove him by Giulio Andreotti, Scalfaro, and Goria. The political instability was joined by a problem with the mafia in 1988. To make matters worse, 1 year later, the big leaders of organized crime were absolved. Prime Minister Siriaco De Mita resigned, and Andreotti gained power. The Greek multimillionaire Aristotle Onassis died in Paris. The great shipbuilding magnate had caused a world commotion by his affair with Maria Callas, only to surprise everyone by marrying Jacqueline Kennedy, the widow of the assassinated president. Onassis left a fortune of over $600 million. Jacques Chirac was replaced by Raymond Barre. In 1976, Barre tackled the economic problems of the country. An artful move allowed European currency to fluctuate in order to ease the crisis caused by the rise in oil prices and inflation. The difficulties did not decrease for Giscard d'Estaing, who opened the Bouberg National Arts Center in 1977. The rise in unemployment was mirrored by inflation. In 1981, François Mitterrand gained the presidency. After 3 years, Mitterrand replaced the Prime Minister Pierre Mauroy with Laurent Fabius. In 1986, elections gave power to Chirac, which forced Mitterrand to govern with the Conservatives. Chirac had a program of privatization, but his decision to resume nuclear testing in a Pacific atoll internationally discredited Chirac. A year later, rail strikes, the demands for independence in Corsica, and conflictive relations with Iran created a climate of social instability. Mitterrand was re-elected in 1988 and he called on Rocard to be Prime Minister. This put an end to his cohabitation with the Conservatives, if not an end to the climate of strikes or corruption. In July 1989, the ship owned by the ecologist group Greenpeace, Rainbow Warrior, was bombed while anchored in Auckland Harbour. The bombs exploded in her hull and a Portuguese photographer was killed. 2 agents from the French Secret Service were detained by the police in New Zealand. The French Minister of Defense resigned. But the shameful French attack did not surprise anybody. Only Germany was free from economic pressures. German inflation and unemployment figures were well below the European average. Helmut Schmidt became Chancellor in 1980 and found a healthy economy. As he had been finance minister, he took charge of the economy. In the street there were protests against everything: a lack of housing, nuclear politics, and the terrorist group Baader Meinhof. Schmidt kept his chancellorship until 1982. Helmut Kohl followed with the liberal support of Hans-Dietrich Genscher. The political tandem was confirmed by the elections in 1983. A year later, Karl Carstens, who had been in control since 1979, gave way to the new president, Richard von Weizsäcker. The elections in 1987 saw them continue in power. In East Berlin, 1 million people protested against the socialist regime. With the fall of the wall in 1989, the pace of change quickened. Chancellor Kohl proposed unification. A month earlier, the internal fight in the nucleus of the Communist Party had forced Erich Honecker to resign. Honecker had been re-elected Secretary General of the party in 1986 after rejecting perestroika. Egon Krenz gained power, but popular pressure forced him out on the eve of reunification. In Spain, the changes accelerated following the death of Franco in November 1975. Juan Carlos became king, and Arias Navarro was replaced by Adolfo Suárez. Adolfo Suárez amnestied political prisoners, released terrorists, legalized the Communist Party, and gave way to a period of transition. Spain established relations with the USSR while the elections were won by the UCD. A year later, the constitution was passed. In 1979, Suárez repeated his electoral victory. However, 2 years later he resigned and was replaced by Calvo Sotelo. In the interim, Lieutenant Colonel Tejero seized the Congress. Felipe González achieved power with a staggering majority. His government represented the hopes of the Spanish people, but towards the end it was dominated by corruption. Africa was in trouble. In 1979, the Secretary General of the United Nations, Kurt Waldheim, warned Rhodesia and South Africa of the threat of a bloodbath. The border disputes with Mozambique increased. South African intervention in Angola at the time in full-scale civil war was denounced, as was the presence of Soviet and Cuban troops. The Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, condemned Rhodesia, supported the independence of Namibia, and demanded the end of apartheid in South Africa. The conflicts in Soweto were to come later. In 1989, Pieter Botha was replaced by de Klerk, who knew the wisdom of one man, one vote, the only thing which had a future. Africa did not deserve the regimes it suffered. Idi Amin became a troublesome leader of Uganda, especially for England. Amin made the officials sent by England enter his palace on their knees, and the images provoked enthusiasm and support for the leader amongst the Africans. In 1979, faced with Milton Obote's advance, he fled to Libya, leaving 300,000 dead. Bokassa was crowned with great pomp and ceremony Emperor of Central Africa in Bangui. The West smiled at the show. However, Giscard d'Estaing no doubt smiled the most after Bokassa had presented him with precious stones before he was overthrown and condemned to death for his crimes. In 1984, the famine in Ethiopia moved the world. Mother Teresa of Calcutta called the attention of the world to the country. Since the overthrow of Haile Selassie, who died in 1975, the socialist government had taken only months to destroy what had taken thousands of years to create. The Arab world criticized Sadat. He was accused of attempting to approach Israel to negotiate the devolution of Sinai, and the criticism worsened during the agreements at Camp David in 1978. However, only peace would be able to bring back the lost territories. Israel also offered to give Gaza, but Sadat responded, "Too many Palestinians in a place that is too hot." The Palestinian leader Arafat also wished to have a closer relationship with Israel, where Yitzhak Rabin had resigned in 1977. Following the elections, Menachem Begin formed a government and Sadat visited Israel. Sadat's words were not forgiven, and in 1981 he was assassinated during a procession in Cairo. He did not get to see the devolution of Sinai that occurred a few months later. Begin resigned in 1983 and was replaced by Shamir, who was unable to control the situation. The elections in 1984 gave power to Labour, and Shimon Peres formed a government. In Iran, there were protests stirred up by Khomeini from Paris. The shouting of the slogan, "Death to the Shah" in Tehran had become routine since 1977. The naming of General Ahari as chief of government did not calm the situation. Behind everything was the Ayatollah, a type of Mahdi or guru who was to bring peace, however the opposite was true. In 1979, the Shah left the country and Khomeini returned. The firing squads began, and so did the changes. The first to notice the changes were women whose exclusion from social and working life was imposed with the veil and the black dresses. In 1980, Khomeini invaded Iraq and bombed the oil fields in Abadan. The aggression was answered by Saddam Hussein, who attacked Tabriz and occupied Khuzestan. The war paralyzed the production of oil. In 1988, Khomeini died. The people paid great homage to him. The victory of Rafsanjani did not mean any change of political direction. In Latin America, corruption and a lack of good leadership impeded the end of the social and institutional crisis. This was worsened by the failure of initiatives to control debt that had reached $400,000 million, including interest that was also impossible to pay. Peru returned to democracy with the leadership of Belaúnde Terry. However, the shining path was born. In 1984, Vargas Llosa was offered the prime ministership. 2 years later, Alan Garcia, faced by inflation at $200,000 per year and the dilemma of whether to pay the country's debt or tackle the internal problems, opted for the former. In 1989, during the mandate of Alan Garcia, Vargas Llosa failed in his attempt to win the presidency as a candidate for Frente Democrática. In Paraguay, Stroessner, who had been president since 1977, was overthrown in 1989. Meanwhile, in Uruguay, a number of dead bodies floated in the River Plata. After 11 years of dictatorship, elections were held in 1984 and Sanguinete won. In Venezuela, Carlos Andrés Pérez nationalized oil. 2 years later, in 1978, the Christian Democrat Party returned to power under Herrera Campins. They faced social insecurity, corruption, and a squandering of national resources and money. At the end of 1983, Jaime Lucinchi ran up more foreign debt. 4 years later, Carlos Andrés Pérez returned to power. His austere policies caused a revolt in 1989. In Argentina, Isabel Perón, who had replaced her husband, abandoned office due to the pressure of scandals. Inflation reached 400%. The country was bankrupt. 1976 was a terrible year, a year in which the slogan of the dictatorship became certain: the joke is over. Videla ignored the disappeared from the dirty war. The mothers of the disappeared began their protests in the Plaza de Mayo square. The loss of the Falklands War quickened the fall of the dictatorship. In 1983, Raúl Alfonsín won the elections, and 3 years later, the law of the punto final was passed. In May 1989, with the victory of Medem, Justicialismo returned to power. In Chile, Pinochet dissolved the parties and, in search of popular support, called a referendum. Another referendum passed the law for a new constitution. In 1989, Patricio Aylwin was selected with 55% of the votes. The left was hardly represented. The United States promised to give Panama back her sovereignty over the canal in the year 2000 through the Torrijos Treaty, also known as Carter's Treaty of 1977. In 1989, George Bush claimed he felt obliged to invade the country because of the annulment of the elections won by the opposition. Noriega sought refuge in an apostolic nunciature, which he left to be judged in Miami. In China, following the death of Mao in 1976, a year after the death of Chiang Kai-shek, the birth of a new era and a new constitution was awaited. The excesses of the Cultural Revolution were a thing of the past. In 1989, China resumed relations with the USSR. However, it was in this year that the events in Tiananmen Square took place, where the Chinese government opened fire on thousands of students. The technological advances and scientific achievements were enormous. In 1976, Viking 1 sent back the first photograph of the surface of Mars, and the possibility of life on the planet was imagined. The USSR put together the largest spacecraft with 4 independent modules. Also, the rendezvous of Russians and Americans in space opened up new possibilities for cooperation for humanity. NASA designed the first reusable craft, the Space Shuttle. Colombia had an advantage in that it could land directly on the Earth. The first flight left Cape Canaveral in 1981 under the control of John Young and Robert Crippen. The third Discovery took off in 1984, and the fourth, Atlantis, in 1985. Challenger, launched in 1983, had a spectacular mission. Musgrave and Peterson spacewalked whilst attached to the shuttle by a cable. The Soviets built a shuttle with exactly the same dimensions and capabilities as the American model, differing only in one aspect. It was conceived originally to be a glider. It used a heavy launcher using 4 Ks of energy. In November 1988, it successfully completed its first mission. A year later, McCandless went for a ride in space on a scooter. But despite the excitement Challenger had caused, it had a tragic end. In 1986, stalling when it was about to fly its 10th voyage, it exploded in the air, killing its crew of 7 and stopping spaceflight for 2 years. Arno Spencer, who had taken part in the experiments for pioneering satellites such as for Echo and Telstar, won the Nobel Prize for Physics in 1978. In 1980, the tragic death of Grace of Monaco, Grace Kelly, moved the world. In July in 1981, the wedding of Prince Charles and Lady Diana Spencer drew world attention. The most important invention of the era was the compact disc. The system replaced vinyl after 1983. In 1980, the world was shocked by the assassination of John Lennon as he left his hotel. The Seventh Art film mourned Charlie Chaplin and Groucho Marx. It was an era of losses, as Alfred Hitchcock and Orson Welles also died. In 1985, AIDS killed Rock Hudson. Agatha Christie, genius of surprise in the detective novel, died in 1976, whilst Graham Greene, Morris West, and Frederick Forsyth became the most important figures in creative literature. Erich Fromm had said in Fear of Freedom, referring to his era, "Never have words been so abused to hide the truth." Neither had the environment ever been so abused. The end of the decade witnessed the oil slicks in Alaska, deforestation of the Amazonian forests, and the deterioration of the ozone over Antarctica. These abuses of the environment created a new ecological awareness throughout the world. Everything was threatened: the sea, the earth, and the sky. The outlook was terrifying.